Great. Hi, everyone. Hi, welcome to this, hopefully for you guys as well, sunny Wednesday afternoon. We're C3 and we're going to be taking you through setting credible net zero targets. Should be a really great session. We're just before the hour now, so we'll just leave it a couple of minutes before we kick things off. But in the meantime, as a bit of housekeeping, you guys are super welcome to use the chat function. So if you want to just introduce yourself, say maybe where you're from or what you'd like to get most out of the webinar today, that would be fantastic. So myself and Thomas will be moderating the chat. As a quick who the hell am I? So I'm Emily. I'm head of growth at C3. I've worked across sustainability primarily in the plastic and carbon space. And we're very much excited to, hopefully share some insights today. And as I say, we'd love to keep it a little bit interactive. So there are going to be polls throughout. They're going to pop up in the chat function. So you can then just kind of hop in there and respond as you wish. And again, feel free to chat with me, chat with each other. We'll very much be looking after the chat function. Also, with regards to any questions, again, feel free to just ask those as soon as they pop in your head, and I'll make sure that we do cover all of those at the end. If we can take you off mute towards the end and people feel like also speaking directly to us, that is completely fine. But if you'd also still rather just use the chat function, then that is fine as well. Okay, I think we'll leave it a couple more minutes, but perhaps maybe Eddie, Thomas, if you guys just want to introduce yourselves as well, whilst people come in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll kick things off. Nice to see some familiar faces popping up.
Yes.
Couple of clients, and a couple of other people we know. So yeah, hi everyone. I hope you're all well. We're really looking forward to this session to discuss credible net zero targets. So I'm one of the co-founders of C3. I'll introduce myself again when I share the slides and start going through that in a bit more detail. But yeah, great to see so many people joining. We've got 17 people on the call, which is fantastic. Hopefully this will be helpful. Thomas, do you want to do a little intro for yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm the founder associate here at C3, so that means I have a pleasure of supporting Eddie across all things carbon, internal work as well, and of course, helping with this webinar.
Real, yeah, Thomas has been really helpful in creating some of these slides. So I will be sure to shout him out on the ones that he's been designing. So that's good.
Amazing. What I'm going to do quickly before we start, so just as again a bit more housekeeping, the session will be an hour. That will be partly the presentation, but also, as I say, plenty of time for us to kind of interact, for you to ask your questions. If anyone does have to hop off early, don't worry. We will actually send the recording, the PDF, and also a link to chat to us afterwards as well to all of you guys. But I'm also just going to pop in a link here to our Calendly. So we are offering a few sessions to speak to one of our experts, i.e. Eddie or Thomas, or one of our other team members. If there was anything that perhaps popped up that you thought, oh, actually, I'd like to learn a bit more of that or chat specifically about your company, then you are so welcome to click that link. I'll put it in now, and I'll also put it in at the end in case it gets a little bit lost in the chat. Great. Okay, it's a few minutes past. So it's like we've got quite a few people. So perhaps, unless, have I forgotten anything housekeeping wise?
No, all good. I think we're ready to go.
Okay,
Just
good.
just on the cameras and mics function, I can unmute and allow people to unmute and hide cameras on an individual basis. So if people do have questions at the end, just raise your hand. I think you can still do that, and then I can allow you to unmute if you want to. But all put them in the chat, as Emily says. So keep that going as well. There was one other thing I wanted to say before we start. No, I think that's probably
recording, Eddie.
Yes, recording. Yeah. Emily said, yeah, we're recording this as well, so that we'll have a recording at the end. If people do come off cameras, obviously, that will be part of that. Brill, let's get started. Yeah, like I said, really nice to see some familiar faces. Please introduce yourselves in the chat, say hi. Yeah, brilliant. Let's get going. So I'm Eddie, as I said, I'm one of the co-founders of C3, and we help companies measure and reduce their emissions. So we focus on calculations, reporting emissions, measuring your carbon footprints, setting net zero targets. So actually, how much are you going to reduce your emissions, and then also working on strategies to reduce those emissions internally within the business. We work with lots of NHS suppliers, being a big part of the companies that we work with, and therefore we see a lot of these kind of requirements and things from the NHS. So why are we here today? Like I said, we work with a lot of NHS suppliers, so over 30 NHS suppliers and their carbon reduction plans, Evergreen Assessment, carbon reporting in general, SECR, all sorts of bits and bobs. And of course, part of that is setting net zero targets. And we see these concerns come up a lot, and we thought, you know what, let's put on a webinar and discuss these all in more detail so that our clients and also potential people that we might work with can understand what the NHS are asking for in a little bit more detail. So we're going to kick things off with a nice little interactive poll. If I've got these ready for us. So I'd like everyone, let me launch it, have a look in the chat, and you should have a question there around which of these statements resonate with you. So the ones I'll read through them so that you can see what I mean. So we've got, have a look in the chat and you should be able to answer in there. We've got, net zero seems like a bit of a distraction from our core business activities. We want to focus on, you know, what we do best, which is providing services and products to the NHS. And why are the NHS asking us for net zero targets and net zero commitments and all these other things? Another one we see quite a lot is, you know, we're already planning on being carbon neutral, so we're going to balance out our emissions with offsets. Isn't that enough? Surely, you know, balancing out the emissions that we create is a good thing to do. Isn't that enough? The third one is the NHS wants us to set a net zero target, but the guidance is confusing, hard to navigate, or potentially non-existent in some situations. You know, the questions don't necessarily make sense, or the jargon that's being used is confusing. We don't really understand what it's all about. So those are the statements. If you want to just respond with which ones resonate with you, you can select more than one. You can also select all of the above or none of the above. And we'll see some of these coming in here. Okay, interesting. So most people who responded say that the NHS want a set new target, but the guidance is confusing, hard to navigate, or non-existent. Brilliant. A couple of people already looking to be carbon neutral, or maybe already are carbon neutral. Isn't that enough? Can't we just offset those emissions? A few people saying all of the above. Oh, a few people saying none of the above. Interesting. Good to see. Brilliant. Okay, so on to the next slide. That's really good to see that, you know, majority of people are kind of struggling with this, and that means this webinar is perfect for you. So good to see. So on the agenda today, we're going to talk about why NHS suppliers need to care about net zero. What are the drivers there? How exactly are the NHS asking for this? Also, I should say there's a lot here about the NHS. We are not part of the NHS. We work with suppliers, helping them report to the NHS. So this is not stuff that's coming from us, C3. This is you know, how we help our suppliers. We're going to talk a bit about the difference between net zero and carbon neutral. So I'm really glad there's some people here that either are carbon neutral or planning to be carbon neutral, and we can talk about the difference between those two terms, and how, you know, where those kind of fit into NHS requirements. We're going to talk about what a credible net zero target looks like in general, but also for NHS suppliers, the difference between just a net zero target and a credible net zero target. And then we will cover some of the common pitfalls, the mistakes, the things that we see on a regular basis, and we'll summarize with some nice key takeaways for everyone, and hopefully have some questions at the end for questions. In fact, I'm sure we'll have time at the end for questions. This should be about half an hour to 40 minutes in terms of a presentation, and then we should have a good discussion at the end, which is always good fun. So why should NHS suppliers care about net zero? Why is it so important? Well, in 2020, the NHS put out a net zero report where they stated that by the end of the decade, before the end of the decade, these are the word for word quote from them, the NHS will no longer purchase from suppliers that do not meet or exceed our commitment to net zero. A year later, in a sort of article posted by the Chief Sustainability Officer of NHS England, he said, the endpoint is clear. By April 2027, the NHS will no longer purchase from suppliers that have not aligned with our trajectory towards net zero carbon. Now, Those are two clear statements from the NHS saying that they will no longer work with companies that don't take this seriously. There is a clear driver from the NHS for you to set net zero targets and commit to them and continue with them. We also see industry leaders talking about this, that there's a clear and direct link between climate change and health. And therefore, there's this sort of cyclical loop for the NHS, which is just why it's so important, because there are, I'm not going to go too far into the doom and gloom side of this. I don't want to spend too much time on making people feel bad. But there is a clear link between health and climate, and happy to talk about that more if people have questions on that in the end. But what we do know is the rules are tightening. The NHS themselves have set an incredibly ambitious target, and they expect their suppliers to follow suit with their targets as well. The reason for that is because the NHS understand this link between health and climate, and they've started measuring their own emissions, and they split them into two different sort of, I guess scopes in a way. But they talk about the NHS carbon footprint and the NHS carbon footprint plus. And the NHS carbon footprint plus, the sort of additional part, is their suppliers, and that makes up 71% of their emissions, so a huge part of their carbon footprint. And by the way, when we're talking about NHS carbon footprint and NHS carbon footprint plus, it is just their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. They have got some things that are outside of the scopes, but the majority of it is their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, so the stuff that you need to be measuring yourself for your organisation. But a huge part of that is their suppliers. So they are asking this information from their suppliers because it's significant. Now, the NHS's carbon footprint is equivalent to a small country, a country like Croatia or Denmark or somewhere like that. So it is a huge amount of emissions, and they understand that their impact is going to obviously have an impact on the planet and society. So they put forward a roadmap. Now, I hope that the majority of people on this webinar have seen this before. We always bring it up when we're talking to our clients, but also in webinars when we're talking to NHS suppliers around what the NHS have planned out for you for their NHS supplier roadmap. And although there's only 4 boxes here, there's kind of 5 steps that have happened because in 2023, 2024, there was a significant shift in terms of the requirements of who needed to report these emissions. So 2023, it was just contracts over 5 million. 2024, it was actually all new procurement. So we're 3 steps through this 5-step plan that they set out in 2020 for suppliers. And they've given you, a little bit of time for this. It's not sort of next year, we're not going to be working with customers. They've given you sort of 10 years to hit these milestones. So, the next big step is in April 27, which is where companies will need to measure all scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions on a global level, which is quite a significant change from the subset of scope 3 emissions in the UK level. Again, if I'm going too quickly with any jargon or anything, we'll get to the questions at the end. But yeah, when I talk about scope 1, 2 and 3, I'm hoping that everyone here understands what those are. Okay, so that's the roadmap. That's what's coming in April 27, and it directly links to your targets, because there are going to be some sort of things that we talk about later around what you set your targets on, what your target year is, etc., etc., and that links to this change in April 27 coming. So how exactly are they requesting this information? Where do you see, net zero targets being asked for in procurement frameworks, that kind of stuff? Before we get onto that one, I've got another poll. There's someone waiting in the lobby. Let me let them in. I've got another poll coming up, so let me launch this one. And this question is, have you set a net zero target? Now, just to explain the answers, we've committed to net zero, so you might have a net zero commitment of 2045 or 2050. We've committed to net zero and set reduction targets, so you've committed to a target year and said you're going to reduce your emissions by a percentage, or you've not committed to net zero. So if everyone would like to respond to that, and we'll see the answers flowing in. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got some people that have committed to net zero. We've got some people that have committed to net zero and set reduction targets. And we haven't had anyone who's not committed to net zero. That is interesting and expected. So yeah, if you'd like to keep responding to that, we'll give a little bit of time for people to answer that question in the chat. So our numbers are nicely aligned with what the NHS have come out and said. So we went to a webinar the other day by the NHS around their kind of strategy going forward and procurement in general, sustainable procurement in the NHS. And they said that 90% of their spend, of the NHS's spend, so their suppliers' carbon footprint, of their carbon footprint plus, is covered by a net zero target. So we can see this is why we thought this webinar is so important, is because everyone on this call has committed to net zero. Some of them have set targets as well. So actually starting to sort of clarify what this all means is going to be useful. So we see it come up a lot in the carbon reduction plan. So PPN 006, which was previously called PPN 0621. So most of you might know it as PPN 0621. The name was changed to PPN 006. Requires companies to take account for their carbon emissions and create a carbon reduction plan, or a CRP, you might see it abbreviated to, which includes your calculation of emissions, your reduction targets, your net zero commitment, and how you're going to get there. But the target part of it is where we see in this little extract 7.4, where they say, we project that carbon emissions will decrease over the next 5 years to an amount of tons by a certain year. This is a reduction of XX%. Now, that is a target. So there's targets in there. That's a short-term target, which we'll get onto in a minute. But also your net zero commitment. So we commit to net zero by 2050 or 2045. That's also a target. So that's where we see it. We also see it in the Evergreen Assessment questions, where they ask for your net zero target year and sort of absolute intensity targets, all these kind of things. So we're seeing it across the board in Evergreen and in frameworks and tenders, and your carbon reduction plan is where all this comes up, is why it's so important. So what's the difference between net zero and carbon neutral? Because surely if I just balance out the emissions that I created and pay a company to reduce emissions, I'm net zero, aren't I? Is that not how it works? Well, no, it isn't actually. There's a difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, and I'll go into the details a little bit more next. So frustratingly, the NHS have not come out with an absolute definition of what net zero means, which is incredibly difficult for suppliers to then get on board with this. They're committing to something where there isn't a defined percentage of reduction that needs to be achieved to hit that net zero. So the general kind of definition of net zero, which is kind of all we've got to go off at this point, is reducing emissions as much as possible and offsetting the rest of those emissions. So we've got, that's the sort of general definition for net zero. Now, Science Based Targets Initiative is the only official standard for net zero. It's called the Net Zero Standard. And that's the only kind of defined definition of net zero. So we should always be following that in terms of a definition of net zero, because the NHS haven't come out with their own defined percentage reduction for net zero. The reason why we follow that as well is there's another indicator, is that the NHS are asking in the Evergreen Assessment, have you had your targets validated? And if we look at the criteria matrix of the Evergreen Assessment, being validated gets you further up those points. So they're obviously following Science Based Targets Initiative. There are other net zero standards coming out in the future, but all of the ones that we know of so far follow the Science Based Targets Initiative. So it's quite generally understood that the Science Based Targets Initiative is the standard for net zero, and that's what we should all follow. So a lot of this is going to be based on that. In general, the general rule of thumb is a reduction of 90% by your target year. And that's at the latest 2050, with the remaining 10%, so you get that 90% reduction, the remaining 10% being removed with high quality removals. Like I said, there are differences in this for different industries and various other complications. I don't have time to go through every single different type of net zero target for different industries in this webinar, but if you want to talk about specifics, please book in with the link that Emily shared, and we can have a proper conversation. But in general, it's 90% reduction. That's what you should be aiming for cross-sector pathway of net zero when it comes to Science-Based Targets Initiative. So that's what we define as net zero. Carbon neutral is not the same. So this is something that you can achieve shorter term, and this is where you're balancing out those emissions or offsetting your emissions that you've created in the previous year to become carbon neutral. Again, so I'll show you in another graph in a second, but effectively, carbon neutral is a short-term possibility. Net zero is only possible when you've hit those reductions and achieved the reductions that you need to do. There's also differences in terms of the types of credits that can be used, or kind of offsets that can be used. And the key bit here is the NHS are not asking you to be carbon neutral. They're not saying you need to be carbon neutral next year or by 2050. They're saying you need to commit to net zero and achieve net zero by your target year. It's different to carbon neutral. It's different from just offsetting alone. It requires reductions. So a nice little graph. This is a courtesy of Thomas. Actually, he put this together, which is really, really helpful. If you imagine your total emissions here on the y-axis, you start off with your calculation, you measure your 12-month period, and you start to work on reductions as they come down to your net zero target year. This is the 90% reduction we've been talking about. The offsetting of those emissions, once you've achieved some reductions, you offset those emissions, that's when you can become carbon neutral. But you can only become net zero once you've hit that 90% reduction or actually reduced your emissions and remove the rest. That's the difference between carbon neutral and net zero, and that's why just offsetting alone is not enough, although it is a good thing to do. So what does a credible net zero target look like? We've spoken a little bit about what net zero means, the definition of net zero by SBTi, but what does a credible net zero target actually look like for suppliers? Credible really means plausible, achievable, well, in terms of this target setting side of things, plausible, achievable, and aligned to the climate science. So plausibility and achievability, kind of there's some crossover there, but if you see a company setting a net zero target of 2030 for, in general, we're going to be net zero by 2030, it's unlikely that they're going to achieve that through reductions, achieve a 90% reduction by that time. So much of the reductions have to require an infrastructure change on the change in the grid, on all sorts of other things. That's such an ambitious target that it's almost not plausible. Excuse me. Especially if you're freighting, goods and manufacturing goods, etc., etc. So that's the sort of first point to note. Achievable. Have you got a plan to get there? Do you know what you're going to do? Is it reasonably likely that you're actually going to achieve that target? And then finally, is it aligned to the science? Is it that 90% reduction we're looking for? Is it sort of 42% reduction by 2030? Again, I'll talk about that in a second. But is it aligned to the science of 1.5 degree warming? Now, the only problem with this aligned to the science situation, unfortunately, is that the science has actually been wrong, but not in the way that climate deniers hoped, actually in the other way. We're going faster in the wrong direction than we thought, and last year we breached 1.5 degrees warming. It doesn't mean we've officially breached 1.5 degrees warming, because you take a 10-year rolling average, but what this is telling us is actually we need to go faster and to reduction. So we actually need to reduce our emissions more than the targets are saying in order to stick to 1.5 degrees. The reason that's important is every single degree above 1.5 degrees every single fraction of a degree above 1.5 degrees causes more and more significant climate breakdown. So this is a case of we need to act fast, we need to act now to actually hit these reductions. And actually hitting 1.5 is going to be very, very hard, if not impossible. We might go over it and then come back down if we do enough reductions in time. So that's the credibility side of things. So we've split out the target setting process into 4 really, really simple, really easy to do actions. Rather than overcomplicating it, we want to make this as easy as possible to understand. The first thing you need to do is select a base year. You start with a year in question, a 12-month period that you measure. You calculate the emissions for that year, for the 12-month period. You then choose your target year of when you're going to reduce emissions by and the percentage, and then choose the type of target, absolute, intensity, short-term, long-term, etc. There are obviously steps in between these. This is an oversimplification, but I didn't want to complicate this and make this sort of difficult to understand. It could be as simple as this if you've got straightforward emissions. So step 1, selecting the base year. You need to select a 12-month period. Most of you already done it. If you've done a carbon reduction plan, you've got emissions measurements for a 12-month period. But one of the interesting things here is which year are you going to use, and which year have you used, and do you need to reset that year or recalculate that year because of upcoming changes, which is a big part of what's happening in April 27. The base year is the year that you're going to be setting all of these percentage reductions from. So you want to have a year that's got everything in it, a year where you've measured everything. Because one of the problems we're going to see in the pitfalls is around this subset of emissions that's been required to be measured versus all relevant scope 3. And if you've set targets on a subset of emissions and you're measuring all of scope 3, you need to either reset your base year to the year where you've got all of that, or recalculate the year where you started, which is again more sort of work to be doing. Some other bits around that. The other thing around COVID, so lots of companies have their base year of 2021, 2022, 2020. And actually, if you've set your targets from a year that's atypically low because of COVID, it's going to be very hard to achieve those 90% reductions. So you might want to look at, again, resetting your base year to a year that's more appropriate, that's more typical, where we didn't have complete kind of shutdown of business operations, where emissions were artificially low. So yeah, like I said, we recommend using the base year for all of your scopes, so scope 1, 2, and 3, and for a full set of all relevant scope 3 for all of those reasons as explained. Step 2, calculate emissions. Again, a lot of this is kind of our bread and butter at C3. What we do best is measuring emissions, calculating across scope 1, 2, and 3. Again, that calculation, you want it to be as high quality as possible, because you can only show reductions if you have a good measurement of the emissions. If you're estimating a lot of emissions, if you're using a huge amount of spend based factors and doing some generic calculations, it's going to be difficult to show those reductions in emissions. This has to be done annually for your carbon reduction plan. You have to keep it updated within 6 months of the end of your reporting period. And although April 27 seems like a while away, if you think about it, you only have 3 months of 2027 to do any measurements. So next year is the year you want to be measuring your full scope 3 of emissions. Otherwise, you're leaving it quite late, and it's going to be quite difficult. It's possible, but it's going to be quite difficult to get your calculations done in that time. For bigger companies, almost impossible. Yeah, and they're time consuming, right? Especially if you're doing this manually, if you're using spreadsheets, if you're using sort of manual calculation ways of calculating, it's going to take time. So, recommendation is to use some external help, a software of some sort, or companies that can help you with these calculations. C3 ourselves, we've built a huge amount of tech and software, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit, to make these really easy for clients to do, so we can do full calculations. Choosing the target year. So again, where does the target year come from? Why do you set a target of 2050? Why do you set a target of 2045? Ultimately, this is actually up to, again, this is based on the science. So 2050 being the latest year that you can set a net zero target for, is because we have to be net zero by 2050 as a planet. With the NHS, they have set a net zero target of 2040 for their own internal operations, for their NHS carbon footprint, and 2045 for their suppliers. So when we talk about aligning to the NHS net zero target, 2045 is the target year they're looking for. Short-term targets typically are between 5 and 10 years. Most of the time, companies are setting short-term targets at 2030. So again, I know it's quite sort of basic, but those are the ways that the target is chosen, really. For your short-term target, it can be anything between 5 and 10 years, normally 2030. For a long-term target, it's going to be either 2050, 2045, or if you're really ambitious, 2040 or 2035, but probably 2045 or 2050. And then again, the general rule for science-based, science-aligned targets or near-term targets, you want to be looking at a 42% reduction by 2030. The reason for that, again, this is from the SBTi, is that it's 4.2% per year, but even if you start your baseline year after 2020, you still need to start your target from 2020. So it's 42% reduction, even if your baseline year is 23, 24, 25. Even if it's 2029, it's still 42% reduction, because the later you leave it, you still need to reduce those emissions down to an absolute number. So a little bit about different types of targets. Again, I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible, but near-term, short-term targets, 5 to 10 years, normally 2030. Long-term targets, your net zero target year, 2045, 2050, 2040. You can set different targets across scope 1 and 2 have to be the same target, same year, sorry. You can set different targets across scope 1, 2, and 3. So you can combine them, set targets across scope 1 and 2, set targets across scope 3. Again, this really depends on how you want to set your targets. And there's so much variety here in how you can go into this that, you know, going through every single example is going to take a while. But I'll explain some of the differences between absolute versus intensity. An absolute target would be a percentage reduction across your emissions by a given year from a base year. So we will reduce our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 42% by 2030 using 2020 as a base year. That is an absolute target. You've measured your 100 tons, you're going to get it down to 58 tons. That's an absolute target. An intensity target, so economic or physical, is based on a unit of growth. So that might be your per employee, it might be per unit of revenue, pound of revenue, or it might be per unit of goods sold or kilogram of goods sold. The reason for that is for those high growth industries where you're going to see a huge amount of growth and your absolute emissions are going to rise. The problem with intensity targets is they have to be more ambitious than your absolute targets, because as you grow, your emissions still need to come down. So you can use it if you're a high growth industry, but we would usually recommend it's a lot easier to set absolute targets. That's what we would kind of recommend. On top of this, so we've got near term, long term, different scopes, targets, and then also absolute and intensity. You can also set supplier engagement targets. Now, this might be for companies that want to find, you know, say a percentage of our suppliers are going to have a science-based target, or they're going to have a net zero target by a certain year. And this supplier or customer engagement target is a little bit like what the NHS are kind of doing to their suppliers by saying, we need you to commit to net zero. 90% of their emissions by spend is backed by a net zero target. That's where this kind of stuff comes in. So you can start to influence suppliers and say, actually, we're going to only work with you if you have a net zero target, etc. And that's how the influence spreads, because a lot of your scope 3 emissions are someone else's. Well, I mean, all of your scope 3 emissions are someone else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. And therefore, by setting these targets on spend or on procurement, you can start to drive emissions down in your supply chain. And that's how this spreads throughout. Okay, I think this is our final poll. After all of that information, I know there's a lot in there, so forgive me. But after all of that information, I've got a final question. Do you think your net zero target is credible? And when I say credible, I mean, is it on track to hit reductions? Is it achievable? Is it plausible? And is it aligned with the science? So yeah, we've got options: yes, no, still not sure, or not set a target. If people would like to respond to that and submit, and we'll see what the responses are coming through. Okay, we've got quite a few people saying still not sure. That's completely fair. So hopefully we can open up the floor to questions at the end. We've got a few more slides to do first. And we can get those people who are still not sure whether they're credible. We can answer some of those questions. I will say that, you know, it might be quite difficult to answer specific questions about companies in this setting. We might need to have a bit more of a detailed conversation around this, because, like I said, there are some complexities there that we need to consider. Okay, common pitfalls of setting targets. So this is, we've kind of mentioned a couple of these in the run up to this. There are lots of other potential things that can go wrong here, but we've kind of highlighted the three main ones for NHS suppliers. The first one is not covering all relevant scope 3 emissions. So majority of companies or NHS suppliers who've got a carbon reduction plan have measured their scope 1, measured their scope 2, and measured a subset of their scope 3 emissions, which includes transport, waste, employee commuting, business travel, and downstream transport. So there's 2 transport categories. That's what most NHS suppliers have measured. And as we saw at the beginning, in April 27, that's changing from that subset of 5 to all relevant scope 3 emissions, which includes 10 other categories, of which there is things like purchased goods and services and capital goods, which are a huge proportion of your emissions. Up to 80-90% of your emissions are covered by your purchased goods and services, depending on your industry. Obviously, sometimes it's 60-70%. So the pitfall there is you've got these targets, but they're only covering your subset of scope 3 emissions, and a real net zero, a credible, a proper net zero target covers all of your scope 3 emissions. So you either need to recalculate the base year in some way, or reset the base year to a different year where you've measured all of your scope 3, And this is where, you know, it gets complicated, and we don't want to be resetting the base year every single year. You add more data and do better calculations. You want to be starting from a good point. I will say that you can, you know, for these initial calculations, you can include estimates. So you can apply spend-based factors to some of these areas. So it's not as difficult as everyone thinks it is. So don't worry too much about this full scope 3 calculation. It is possible. Obviously, we want to get as good data as possible, but in some situations, it's very hard to do that. But it shouldn't put you off from doing it in the first place. Yeah, and I think, you know, it's a fundamental problem here, because if you're committing to net zero, you're talking about all of your emissions. You're not just talking about the subset you've measured. Pitfall 2, selecting the base year that's not representative. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. So we obviously had COVID, massive change in emissions across the board. We saw a dip in emissions worldwide, and actually we saw a dip in emissions in companies' measurements. Now that's fine if you started your base year for 2018, 2019, you saw the dip and then it popped back up again, probably a bit lower actually, because we all started to return. You know, we didn't go back to work 5 days a week in some situations, so you know, that's fine. But if you set your baseline year from down here, getting a 90% reduction from there is a lot harder than if you set it from before or set it from after, where things have returned to normal. So again, selecting a baseline year that's not representative. You can do things like smooth this out with multiple years, averages and things like that. But you want to take a year that's representative of all business activity or typical business activity. And then finally, counting offsets as emissions. So saying, actually, we're just going to pay for some trees and offset our emissions, and we don't need to worry about it anymore. You can do that, but it doesn't mean you're net zero. It doesn't actually account to any reductions in emissions. It's different. We're not saying that it's a terrible thing to do. If you've got spare money and, you know, you want to support projects in your local area or do some fantastic things, remove emissions, go ahead and do it. It's brilliant to do, but it's not real reductions. It is balancing out those emissions. It's a different thing. You still need that reduction of 90%. Okay, we're nearly there, I think. It's been kind of whistled through all of this. Key takeaways. So yeah, overall, net zero targets, they are complicated. There's a lot of jargon being used. I've tried not to, but I'm sure I've used lots of jargon in this presentation. I'm hoping that everyone's going to be asking me questions about all of it as we go through. But it does, you know, it's not impossible, but it does require careful consideration, and you do need an element of understanding to do it. You don't just want to slap a net zero target on something and go with it. We know there are clear drivers. We know this isn't going away. You know, even if political will changes, even if things happen in the government and things are changing, we know the NHS is taking this seriously, and climate change is happening. Therefore, you know, it will always become more of a problem as we see more climate breakdown. And industry leaders, big players, they're also talking about this too. So it's not even just from an NHS perspective. Also, other customers, other suppliers, other people in your value chain asking you for this data. It is going to keep coming up. So getting it right first time is a good thing. The targets themselves are really important in NHS tenders. So they're asking for this information. We want to make sure it's all been done properly and you have all the right answers and it all all the balances and checks add up to the right numbers. And it's a requirement for public sector tenders over a certain amount, over 5 million, but actually it's a requirement for all NHS tenders or all new procurement. There are some situations under, I think it's £10,000 on a contract, you might get away with not having a carbon reduction and just having a net zero commitment, but it is a crucial part of tenders and they have stipulated that it's something that they are committed to. Net zero and carbon neutral, not the same thing, although they are used interchangeably and they are interlinked, they are not interchangeable. Carbon neutral is short term, net zero is long term. Carbon neutral is offsetting your emissions, net zero is reducing your emissions and offsetting the rest. And a net zero target should be aligned to the science. We don't have a defined percentage reduction from the NHS. We should align it to the science. We should align it to what needs to happen in the planet to achieve reductions. It shouldn't just be based on it needs to be aligned to the science. So this slide, we thought long and hard about this slide and including this, and I wanted to be really open, honest, and frank with with clients, but also with people in the industry around what is the minimum requirement that you need to do to achieve so that you can comply with these NHS requirements. And then where should you be? Because there are companies here that will treat this as a tick box exercise. And although it pains me to say I don't want this to be a tick box exercise, it should be something that all companies are taking seriously. We thought it was useful just to highlight what actually is the minimum requirement. What do we actually need to do to get to complete the carbon reduction plan properly? And at the moment, that is just having a net zero target of 2050, measuring your emissions across 1, 2, and the subset of scope 3 at a UK level. So that's just right now. In April 27, it needs to be net zero by 2045 and all relevant scope 3 at a global level. So that is a requirement that needs to happen. But there isn't a defined percentage reduction. So you don't have to do the 90% reduction. That's what the science says, but you don't have to do that. So for companies that don't think that's at all possible, the NHS aren't asking you to commit to 90% reduction. It's just what we're suggesting is the right thing to do. Disclosure of standard carbon reduction actions. Again, the reduction side of things, you don't need to have a perfectly modelled exact definition pathway to net zero for NHS tenders. This is only for NHS tenders. Again, it's difficult for me to say it because we think it's really important to have all those things. But from an NHS perspective, they're not asking you for the absolute perfect defined pathway to net zero. They're just asking you for some reduction actions, from reduction strategies. What are you going to do to reduce your emissions? Are you going to switch to EVs? Are you going to install LEDs in the office, that kind of stuff? You don't need to offset your emissions now. Again, we would suggest it's a good thing to do. If you have the spare cash and you want to support projects, fantastic. But you don't need to, from an NHS perspective, you don't need to be carbon neutral. You can wait until your net zero target year to remove the final 10% as long as you reduce those emissions. But you do have to measure your emissions every year, and you do have to disclose your targets and talk about all these things. So that's the absolute minimum. That's like what everyone has to do, and that won't differentiate you from any of your competitors. That won't, show that you're a leader. That will just be the basic what has to happen tick box exercise. What we suggest you need to do, and what the industry thinks you need to do, and what the best practice is to align to the science, is to have 42% reduction by 2030, 90% reduction by 2045, validate them with SBTi. Again, it's a long process, it's difficult to do, but that is best practice. Modeling those reduction strategies, so making sure that you have a plan of how your specific strategies are going to impact your emissions and how you're going to get to that 90% reduction. So that's an important way. You need to know how you're going to get there. Addressing ongoing emissions, taking responsibility for the emissions you're creating at the moment. If in the net zero sort of guidance, if you're reducing, you're forgetting about everything below the graph. You're creating emissions as you go. So you should take responsibility for those through removals, offsets, and kind of research and other things in there. And then also publicly putting these into sustainability reports, rather than sort of squirreling them away on your website or in a sort of a hidden URL, which is what the NHS are sort of asking for, but actually putting that out there and talking to people about it, and talking to your competitors and talking to your suppliers and talking to everyone in your value chain. That's kind of best practice, what we see as best practice. Okay, final slide. We're C3. All of the content in this webinar is stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis, and the majority of our customers are NHS suppliers. We help with all scope 1, 2, and 3 calculations and enable you to get to that compliance stage and beyond. So we can help you with we draft your carbon reduction plan for you. All you need to do is check over it, make sure you're happy with it, and sign it off. We sit down with you on an Evergreen Assessment call, and we actually answer the questions with you so that you understand them and you get them right. And then we also do full net zero strategies implementation plans. We model those emissions and how you're going to see the reductions and where those reductions are going to come from. Are you going to be able to achieve 90% reduction? We built a huge amount of tech to enable us to do this without you having to spend a huge amount of time on data collection. So we extract the data from expenses and raw material, report builder materials, energy bills, all sorts of things, transport stuff, anything where you can get data from your suppliers, we can then extract it from there. My co-founder, Adam, has a PhD in data science, and this is effectively a data problem when it comes to measuring emissions. And we can help you set credible net zero targets and actually achieve them. So that is everything from me. I hope that was helpful. I haven't been keeping up to date on the chat, so yeah, have we had some good questions coming in? How's it all been going?
Hi, thanks, Ed. Thanks for that. Yes, we've just got one in from Ian. So I'm going to read it out and then let you crack on. So, firstly, Ian says, thanks for the webinar. So that's great. He says, like a number of companies, most of our emissions are in shipping and freight. We are doing the things we can, virtually eliminating air freight, reducing product packaging, size/weight, using reputable shipping companies with good environmental performances, etc. But how do we predict how shipping emissions will fall over the next 24 years for our net zero plan when the reductions in this area will mainly come from industry changes/technology that is not yet available? How do we account for it? Thanks, Ian.
Brilliant question. Thanks, Ian, and thanks for all that information as well. So you're absolutely right. When we're thinking about reductions, it's not all on an individual company's head. It can't. This is how scopes of emissions work, right? So scope 1 and 2, that is all on your head, really. You're responsible directly for the energy that you buy and the fuel that you use. So that is directly responsible. When we're talking about shipping, I'm assuming this is in part of your scope 3 transportation and not your own fleet, is my assumption here. When you're talking about that, yes, you're right. There are going to be some situations where it's on someone else. Your scope 3 emissions are someone else's scope 1 and 2. So one thing you can do is check that they have a net zero target. Your delivery provider, have they got a net zero target? Are they doing everything to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions? And can you align your reductions in that area to your supplier's net zero target? So that's one way of accounting for it. If you don't know who your supplier is, I think there's some situations where you've got third-party logistics providers that use third-party logistics providers, and it's very difficult to know who's actually moving these goods. There are some sort of generic macroeconomic decarbonisation factors that can be applied to these to plot those reductions. So we do this with things like business travel, where we don't necessarily know on every flight who the carrier is or what plane's going and that kind of stuff. And if we want to plot reductions across those, we might use some macro decarbonisation factors where we know that, electricity, maybe not flights, it's not the best example of trains. Electricity is going to decarbonise. We can use those factors to plot reductions across those. But whenever we do those calculations, just to let everyone here on the call know, it doesn't get you to the 90% reduction. You still also need to take action. So that might be moving from air freight to shipping freight. But like you already said that you're doing these things. I'm sure you're already doing this, like consigning deliveries in one delivery. Like making sure that the routes that you're sending them on or the places that you're sending them to are optimized. So there are things that you need to do. There are some also factors that will happen, and there are things that your suppliers will do. And all of those together, they have to get to that 90% reduction by 2050 or 2045, depending on when your target is. Does that answer the question? And you're right, some of it, some of it's not, some of the technology isn't available, but some of those factors, the UK puts them out as well, these decarbonisation factors, they do take into account things like sustainable aviation fuel and various other things. So again, I'm more than happy to have a conversation in more detail around that and sort of discuss that in a bit more detail, and if you want to book in.
Nice. If anyone else has more questions, please do feel free to pop them in the chat. I think Ian was pretty happy with that, so that's great. I realise we've gone through quite. Oh, sorry, Ed.
I was just going to say, also raise a hand if anyone wants to come off mute. Raise a hand, and I'll stop sharing. I can unmute them, or not unmute them for them, but allow them to be unmuted, and then they can unmute themselves, and we can have a chat if anyone has any further specific questions.
Yes. I think we can unmute everyone. Maybe that's a bit much. I was going to say, I don't know, we've covered a lot there, and people are probably still processing it, which is fair enough. Is there anything you feel maybe people should ask you, or perhaps questions that you get a lot from existing clients that it's helpful to cover?
Yeah, I think it's kind of that slightly difficult slide that I showed around comply and compete, where it was sort of the minimum requirement. I think, I want to be completely honest and open here with this conversation. We've got to take into consideration that the NHS suppliers are businesses, and there needs to be a focus on the sustainability of the business from a financial perspective. And we understand that. We're not saying that this is a case of you all need to change your complete business models so that your emissions reduce. often reductions can also create efficiencies. So if we can reduce the amount of energy we're consuming, if we can reduce the amount of fuel that we're consuming, there's a money saving part of it there. So there are other benefits to this that's not just about hitting these targets and ticking these boxes. So I think that would be my only kind of additional point to add there, is that we don't need to, although I would like to frame this as a planetary reason and a climate change reason, that's definitely how I want to talk about it. We know that lots of companies, and especially people high up in companies, struggle to understand it from that perspective and want to understand it from a financial perspective. So having that communication, having that conversation around the other benefits of this is important, and being able to talk to those points is important as well. I think that would be one thing to add. The other thing is it's not just the NHS. Although this whole webinar has been about the NHS, we're seeing other big companies saying to their suppliers, a bit like the supplier engagement targets we talked about, you need to set an SBTI based target, or you need to be validated by SBTI by 2028. We've had that with one of our clients who we got through the SBTI validation process. But they're a tiny company. They were sort of 30 people, minuscule, and they had to have their targets validated by SBTI. And it was really frustrating because they had such a small footprint. It was almost not worth them doing it. But these big suppliers are asking for this data. So it's not just the NHS. This can be coming from any direction. Investors can be asking for this. Employees could be asking for this. They could be saying, actually, we want the company we work for to be environmentally strong. So yeah, this can come from lots of different directions. It's not just the NHS. This can help you in a way where you can be ahead of those questions. You can be ahead of your investors asking questions. Sustainability backed loans. You can get better rates on loans if you have good environmental commitments. There's all sorts of other benefits there from doing this kind of stuff.
Great, epic. So I think there's no more questions. Unless anyone is feeling brave and wants to hop off mic. We have got about 9 minutes left, but also appreciate that, of course, people are busy. So we can also end it there. If there's nothing else. I have just re-put that link in just in case there were more questions, but perhaps you felt they were a little bit too specific to your company, which would make a lot of sense. And I've also just linked in C3 case studies as well. And of course, you're so welcome to add any of us on LinkedIn. We post a lot of useful content, especially for NHS suppliers, and really, aiming to keep ahead of the curve and provide as much updated information as possible. And thanks everyone for kind of sitting through and absorbing all of that. As I say, we will be sending it around. Oh, we do have another question from Craig. What can you do to help with engagement with our suppliers who are not being pushed by anyone else? That's a good one.
Brilliant question. And again, to be completely honest with all this stuff, sometimes we ask customers questions of sort of, how much are you being asked about this? And a couple of years ago, it was no one's asked us about this. It's just the NHS. And the last couple of years, since then, we've had people, actually, we've had that in a couple of sustainability questionnaires. And what we're predicting is that in a couple of years' time, it's going to be part of all sustainability questionnaires. Now, I say that because one of the ways that you can engage with suppliers is providing them with a roadmap, a bit like the NHS have done. So saying, this is our plan. We've done these measurements. These are the measurements that we've got for the emissions that we're calculating for you. This is our plan, what we're going to do. And have you measured your emissions, Mr. Supplier One? Have you set a net zero target? Have you got a plan to measure your emissions? Have you set a net zero target? And they might all say no to these questions, but then you can start to build up data to say, actually, in a couple of years' time, we know that this other supplier who can provide us with this information do have a net zero target. They have calculated their emissions, and you can start to make those decisions. And they're difficult decisions to make, right? It's not an easy thing to do, but you can start to. And it's a bit. Another example here is, no one else is pushing them. You're the only people asking. Let's just say, it's a bit like the sort of the lobbying the government as an example. If everyone says, well, no one else is lobbying the government, therefore let's not because it's not going to make any difference. The more people that do, the more people that ask the questions, the more they're being pushed, and the more then they'll have to supply this information. So it's a collective effort, and be the first one. Why not? See what happens. And they might not be able to give you any data for a year or 2 or 5, but in 5 years, all of your competitors who use those suppliers might also be asking the same questions. Brilliant. All right. Well, thanks so much. I think hopefully that answers your question, Craig. I think it's a case of there are situations where people aren't being asked for this, but the more you ask, the more likely it's going to happen.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for that, Craig. Lauren says thanks. She has to hop off. No worries at all, but she's booked a call to discuss further. So that
Great
is
to meet you. Great to meet you, Lauren. Thanks everyone so much for coming along. I hope it was useful. I tried to be as clear and as simple as possible with this, whilst also being kind of absolutely true and honest with as much, of what the NHS are actually looking for versus what we think is a good and sensible thing to do. I think that was really what I wanted to get out of this, was to show you that it is possible. You can do this, but it does take a little bit, it does take some action, and you do need to see that implementation. I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for the engagement, and looking forward to speaking to you all soon. And we'll be doing another webinar at some point in the new year, hopefully in March. Any ideas, if anyone has any requests, whether it's on carbon offsetting, whether it's on reduction strategies, whether it's on supplier engagement, we could do a whole one on supplier engagement. Please put your thoughts, send me an email. My email is eddie@c3. I'll pop it in the chat.
Yeah.
Either send me an email, book in, and then we can have a conversation, or we can do another webinar, and hopefully we can get some good bits of information as well.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Perfect.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Have a lovely day, everyone.